The fastest way to lose your own land is to let someone else believe it belongs to them long enough. I learned that lesson the moment my truck rolled to a stop in front of the old gravel entrance to my father's farm. The familiar crunch of limestone beneath my tires should have sounded like home, but instead I heard the sharp crackle of a security radio followed by the slow swing of a black metal barricade blocking the only road I had driven since I was old enough to reach the pedals of my father's pickup. Two private security guards stepped into the middle of the entrance wearing dark uniforms with the Homeowners Association logo stitched across their jackets. One of them raised his hand before I even opened my door. "Sir, you are not authorized to enter this property." For a second I honestly thought they had mistaken me for someone else. I smiled, pointed toward the weathered white farmhouse sitting nearly half a mile beyond the oak trees, and told them my father lived there. The older guard glanced at a clipboard without changing his expression. "Luke Carter?" he asked. I nodded. He looked back at the paper before speaking in a voice so calm it almost sounded rehearsed. "You have been permanently banned from entering this community." The words hung in the cool morning air while the smell of freshly cut grass drifted over from the subdivision next door. I stared past the guards toward the old barn where I had spent every summer helping my father repair fences, stack hay, and grease tractor bearings. Nothing about that view had changed except the expensive houses now lining the edge of what used to be open pasture. A black sport utility vehicle rolled slowly toward the entrance and stopped beside the barricade. The driver's door opened, and a woman stepped out wearing a tailored navy blazer, polished heels, and the kind of confident smile that only appears when someone believes every rule is already on their side. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," she said. "I am Patricia Morgan, president of Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association." She extended a folder toward me without taking another step. Inside were several neatly organized pages covered with official-looking language, highlighted sections, and legal references that immediately caught my attention. Before I could ask a single question, Patricia folded her hands and spoke as though she had delivered the same speech many times before. "Your family's access privileges have been revoked. You are no longer permitted to enter through this roadway." I looked from the folder back to the gravel road stretching toward my father's farmhouse. "This road has belonged to my family for generations," I replied. Patricia's smile never moved. "According to our records, this entrance now falls under Homeowners Association authority." Behind her, several residents slowed their morning walks to watch the conversation unfold. A delivery van stopped near the neighborhood entrance. Even the school bus approaching from deeper inside the subdivision reduced its speed as curious faces turned toward the argument. Every pair of eyes seemed convinced I was the outsider. My phone buzzed with a message from my father asking why I had not arrived yet. I looked once more at the dusty road disappearing beneath the same towering oak trees he planted decades ago. And for the first time in my life, I realized someone had convinced an entire neighborhood that I did not belong on my own family's land. I backed my truck onto the narrow shoulder without saying another word because arguing in front of strangers would never change what they already believed. Patricia watched me leave with the quiet confidence of someone convinced the matter had already been settled. I drove less than a mile down the county road before pulling into the gravel parking lot of a small country church where my father and grandfather had attended services for decades. The old white steeple stood exactly as I remembered, surrounded by cedar trees that filled the cool morning air with a familiar scent. My phone rang almost immediately. It was my father. His voice sounded older than it had only a few months earlier, but it carried the same calm strength I had heard my entire life. He apologized before I could say a word. He told me he never imagined they would actually stop me from coming home. My father had been living on Carter Farm for more than 40 years after inheriting it from my grandfather, who cleared the first fields with little more than determination and borrowed equipment. Long before luxury homes, decorative entrance signs, or homeowners association meetings appeared in the area, our family measured time by harvest seasons, fence repairs, and the sound of rain falling across open pasture. I spent nearly every summer there as a boy. I learned to mend fences before I learned to drive. I could still remember the smell of fresh hay inside the old red barn and the rough feel of weathered fence posts beneath my hands. My father always believed the land deserved respect because every acre carried a piece of our family's history. As nearby towns expanded over the years, developers gradually purchased neighboring ranches and transformed them into carefully planned residential communities. Willow Creek Estates became the largest of them all. New streets replaced cattle trails. Decorative ponds appeared where wild grass once grew. Expensive homes slowly surrounded the edges of our property, yet Carter Farm remained exactly as it had always been. My father refused every offer to sell. Whenever someone asked why, he would simply smile and point toward the old gravel road leading from the county highway to our farmhouse. He always repeated the same sentence: "Everything begins with the road." As a teenager, I thought he was talking about driving tractors or hauling cattle. Years later, after leaving to build my own career several states away, I assumed he was speaking about memories. I never asked him to explain because I believed there would always be another visit home. Now those words echoed differently inside my mind. Everything begins with the road. Before ending the call, my father told me there was a spare key hidden exactly where it had been for 20 years beneath a loose stone behind the old equipment shed, but he also warned me not to force my way onto the property. "Do this the right way," he said quietly. "The land has waited generations. It can wait a little longer." I looked back toward the entrance hidden beyond rows of oak trees and realized something else had remained unchanged all these years. No matter how many houses surrounded the farm, every vehicle entering or leaving that neighborhood still traveled across the same old gravel road my grandfather had built with his own hands. At that moment, I still believed it was only a family memory. I had no idea it was about to become the most important piece of evidence in my entire life. The next morning, I returned to the county with a notebook instead of an argument. Every instinct told me to drive back to the farm entrance and demand an explanation, but my father had spent his entire life teaching me that emotion never changes a property line. Facts do. My first stop was the county records office, a brick building that had probably looked the same for 50 years. The familiar smell of old paper, polished wood, and aging file cabinets filled the quiet room as a clerk directed me toward the public land records terminal. Before searching anything, I opened the folder Patricia had handed me. Every page looked official. There were references to community bylaws, security policies, architectural standards, and homeowner regulations. What caught my attention was not what the documents contained, but what they never actually claimed. They described the subdivision in great detail, yet none of them specifically identified who owned the gravel access road leading to my father's farm. It was simply labeled as the community entrance. That seemed like an unusual omission. I searched the county property maps for Willow Creek Estates, and then compared them with older aerial photographs available through the county archive. The subdivision had gradually expanded over several construction phases during the past decade, but one feature remained exactly the same in every image. The entrance road followed the identical path my grandfather had built long before the first house existed. That alone proved nothing, but it made me curious. I printed several maps and drove back toward the farm, stopping instead at a small diner just outside town where local farmers still gathered every morning over coffee. An older rancher named Walter Simmons recognized me immediately. He had known my grandfather for years and asked why I looked so distracted. After I explained what had happened, he leaned back quietly before looking through the window toward the direction of Willow Creek Estates. "Funny thing about that neighborhood," he said. "Everybody thinks those fancy entrance signs mean they own everything behind them." Then he pointed his coffee mug toward the highway. "They are all standing on your answer." I followed his gesture until my eyes settled on the familiar gravel road disappearing beneath the same row of towering live oaks. For the second time in 2 days, someone had directed my attention to that road instead of the houses surrounding it. The coincidence was becoming impossible to ignore. Before leaving the diner, Walter reminded me that my grandfather kept copies of nearly everything inside the old equipment barn, even records most people would have thrown away decades earlier. As I drove away, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was an electronic copy of a formal trespass notice sent by the Homeowners Association attorney. The letter warned that entering the subdivision through the private entrance could result in additional legal action. Reading those words should have made me angry. Instead, they confirmed something much more important. Patricia and the Homeowners Association seemed completely confident about controlling the entrance, but confidence is not ownership. Somewhere between my grandfather's old records and the county archives, I had a feeling the truth was waiting patiently for someone willing to look closely enough. That afternoon, I waited until the sun began dropping behind the trees before driving to the backside of the property, where an old county maintenance lane ended near our northern fence. From there, a narrow footpath crossed a shallow creek and led to the equipment barn without passing through the subdivision entrance. My father had walked that trail for years whenever spring floods covered the lower pasture, and thankfully it remained outside the homeowners association boundaries. The familiar scent of dry cedar, old timber, and sun-baked earth greeted me the moment I stepped onto the farm. Everything looked smaller than I remembered, yet every detail brought back another memory. The weathered windmill still turned slowly above the well. The faded red tractor still rested beside the machine shed. Even the old bell hanging outside the barn remained exactly where my grandfather had installed it decades earlier. I found the loose stone behind the equipment shed exactly where my father said it would be. The spare key was still wrapped inside a small waterproof tin, untouched by time. When the heavy barn door creaked open, a wave of cool air mixed with the smell of dust, motor oil, leather, and old pine drifted toward me. Rows of carefully labeled shelves stretched along both walls. My grandfather had believed every receipt, survey, tax statement, and handwritten note deserved a place. My father had preserved everything exactly as he left it. Hours passed while I sorted through metal filing cabinets and faded document boxes. There were livestock records from the 1970s, equipment warranties, crop reports, handwritten journals, and yellowed envelopes tied together with cotton string. Finally, I noticed a long cardboard tube resting across the top shelf behind several old fence posts. Someone had written one word across the side in thick black marker. Entrance. I carefully removed the cap and slid out several oversized survey maps. The paper crackled softly as I spread the first sheet across an old wooden workbench beneath the hanging shop light. It was an original survey completed years before Willow Creek Estates even existed. The gravel road appeared clearly marked from the county highway all the way to the farmhouse. Another folded document inside the tube caught my attention. It was an easement agreement signed by the original developer during the earliest phase of neighborhood construction. I read every line twice. The agreement granted temporary construction access across a portion of the Carter property while nearby infrastructure was completed, but the language repeatedly referred to the Carter family as the property owner. There was no transfer of ownership, no sale, no permanent dedication, just a limited agreement with specific conditions. My heartbeat slowed as the pieces began fitting together. Tucked inside the final folder was a handwritten note from my grandfather addressed to my father years before I was born. The paper had faded, but one sentence remained perfectly clear. Never confuse permission with ownership. Protect the road because one day it will protect the family. I sat there in complete silence listening to the gentle ticking of rain against the metal roof as those words echoed through the empty barn. For the first time since the security guard stopped me, I no longer wondered whether Patricia had made a mistake. I began wondering whether the entire homeowners association had spent years enforcing rules on land they had never actually owned. The next morning, I carried the survey maps, the easement agreement, and my grandfather's note into the office of Daniel Brooks, a local real estate attorney whose family had practiced property law in the county for 3 generations. His office overlooked the courthouse square, and every wall was lined with thick law books, framed plats, and black and white photographs of farms that had shaped the county long before subdivisions existed. Daniel listened without interrupting while I explained everything from the security guards at the entrance to the documents I had uncovered inside the old barn. When I finally finished, he spread the survey across his conference table and adjusted his reading glasses. For several minutes, the only sound in the room was the quiet rustle of paper as he compared dates, signatures, parcel numbers, and legal descriptions. Then he reached for the easement agreement and read it again from beginning to end. A slight smile appeared on his face, but it was the careful smile of someone who knew better than to celebrate too early. He pointed to one paragraph with the tip of his pen. "This is where everything changes," he said. He explained that an easement gave someone permission to use land under specific conditions, but it did not transfer ownership unless separate legal documents clearly stated otherwise. In this agreement, the original developer had acknowledged the Carter family as the owner of the road several different times. Daniel asked whether I had seen any deed transferring that entrance to the developer or the homeowners association. I shook my head. He searched the county database from his computer, reviewing every recorded transaction connected to Willow Creek Estates. One by one, new homes had been sold, lots had changed hands, and homeowners association documents had been recorded, but the entrance road remained attached to the original Carter parcel exactly as it had been decades earlier. Daniel leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. Either someone made a very expensive assumption years ago, or someone hoped nobody would ever read the original paperwork. Before we discussed any legal strategy, he insisted on verifying every detail independently. He contacted a title company to perform a complete ownership search, requested certified copies of the original subdivision filings, and arranged for a licensed county surveyor to compare the historical plats with current boundary markers. "We do not win property disputes with opinions," he told me. "We win them with records that cannot be argued away." I appreciated that approach because it sounded exactly like something my father would have said. By late afternoon, the first responses began arriving. The title examiner confirmed there was no recorded deed transferring ownership of the entrance road. The subdivision filings referenced access but never identified the homeowners association as the owner. Even more surprising, the surveyor called Daniel personally after reviewing the preliminary maps. He asked one simple question that immediately caught both of our attention. "Has anyone from the homeowners association realized their entire neighborhood depends on that one road?" Daniel looked across the desk at me without saying a word. Neither of us answered right away because we already understood what that question meant. If the surveyor was correct, this dispute had never been about whether I could enter my father's farm. It was about whether an entire subdivision had spent years assuming control over the only entrance they had never legally possessed. Over the next several days, I followed Daniel's advice and resisted every temptation to confront Patricia or anyone from the homeowners association. The strongest evidence never comes from the loudest voice. It comes from patient verification. The county surveyor met us at sunrise near the entrance with modern equipment mounted on bright yellow tripods. From a distance, it looked like an ordinary property inspection, and that was exactly what we wanted. Cars continued rolling through the neighborhood, while residents waved casually, without realizing the boundaries beneath their tires were being measured with inch-by-inch precision. The surveyor spent hours comparing present-day coordinates with the original plats my grandfather had preserved inside the barn. Every iron marker he uncovered matched the historical records. Every property corner confirmed the same conclusion. The gravel entrance road had never been separated from the Carter parcel. It remained exactly where it had always been, legally attached to our family farm. Later that afternoon, we met with the title examiner, who placed a thick stack of certified records across Daniel's conference table. Every transfer of ownership inside Willow Creek Estates had been carefully documented over the years. Hundreds of pages described individual homes, neighborhood common areas, utility easements, drainage corridors, and maintenance responsibilities. Yet despite all those transactions, not one recorded deed conveyed ownership of the entrance road to the developer, the homeowners association, or any other entity. Daniel highlighted several sections where access rights were mentioned. "Notice the wording," he said. "They describe the community using the road, but they never identify the community as owning the road." The distinction seemed small until he explained that in property law, those few words could determine the outcome of an entire case. Before leaving, the surveyor shared one final observation that stayed with me long after the meeting ended. Every resident, every delivery truck, every emergency vehicle, every school bus, and every maintenance contractor entered and exited Willow Creek Estates across that single stretch of gravel built by my grandfather decades earlier. There was no secondary entrance hidden behind another neighborhood. There was no alternate public road connecting the subdivision to the county highway. Everything depended on the Carter family road. Even then, Daniel cautioned me against making assumptions. "Ownership gives rights," he reminded me. "It also creates responsibilities. We are not looking for leverage. We are looking for clarity." I agreed completely. My goal had never been to trap an entire neighborhood. I simply wanted to stand on my family's land without being treated like an intruder. Meanwhile, Patricia appeared more confident than ever. Through neighbors and public meeting minutes, we learned the homeowners association had approved additional security measures around the entrance and continued referring to it as community property. They spoke with absolute certainty because no one had challenged that belief for years. They had inherited an assumption and repeated it until it sounded like fact. Sitting in Daniel's office with certified surveys, title reports, and original county records spread across the table, I realized something Patricia still did not know. The evidence was no longer pointing toward a simple misunderstanding. It was pointing toward a legal truth that would soon force everyone involved to reconsider who had actually been standing on whose property all along. Daniel decided the next move should come from the court instead of from either of us. Rather than filing a lawsuit demanding damages or accusing the homeowners association of misconduct, he prepared a straightforward legal action asking the county court to issue a declaratory judgment confirming ownership of the entrance road. It was a simple request with enormous consequences because once ownership was established, every other question would answer itself. Within days, Patricia and the homeowners association responded through their attorney, insisting that the community had controlled and maintained the entrance for years and therefore possessed the authority to regulate who entered through it. Their response sounded confident, but when Daniel read it carefully, he quietly smiled. They described maintenance schedules, landscaping expenses, security patrols, and community rules, yet they still failed to produce a single recorded deed showing they actually owned the land beneath the gravel. The hearing took place 3 weeks later inside the same county courthouse that had witnessed generations of local property disputes. My father insisted on attending despite moving more slowly than he once had. He wore the same pressed denim shirt and worn leather belt he always chose for important occasions. Before we entered the courtroom, he placed one hand on my shoulder and reminded me that our family had never measured success by how loudly we argued, but by whether we could look people in the eye after the truth came out. Inside the courtroom, Daniel organized every exhibit with quiet precision. The original survey from my grandfather's barn rested beside certified county plats, title reports, historical aerial photographs, tax records, and the original easement agreement. Patricia sat across the room, with several homeowners seated behind her. She appeared calm, occasionally whispering to her attorney while glancing confidently toward our table. When the hearing began, the judge listened carefully as both sides explained their positions. The Homeowners Association attorney spoke first, emphasizing years of maintenance, neighborhood improvements, security oversight, and community reliance on the entrance. Daniel never interrupted. When it was his turn, he stood, walked to the evidence table, and began with a sentence that changed the entire direction of the hearing. Maintenance is not ownership. He then guided the court through every document one by one, tracing the legal history of the property from my grandfather's original survey to the most recent certified title examination. The county surveyor testified that every boundary marker aligned perfectly with the historical records. The title examiner confirmed that no deed transferring ownership of the entrance road had ever been recorded. Finally, a county records official verified that the Carter parcel had remained intact throughout every phase of subdivision development. I watched Patricia's expression slowly change as each witness confirmed another piece of the same conclusion. Her confidence did not disappear all at once. It faded gradually, as though every document removed another layer of certainty she had carried for years. By the end of the hearing, the judge announced that the documentary evidence overwhelmingly established continuous ownership by the Carter family and stated that a written order would soon be issued confirming that conclusion. Walking out of the courthouse, I realized something remarkable. Patricia still seemed focused on losing control of one entrance road. She had not yet grasped the far more important reality that everyone else in Willow Creek Estates would soon have to face. The judge's written order arrived 4 days later, and with a single signature the uncertainty disappeared. The Carter family was confirmed as the lawful owner of the gravel entrance road exactly as the historical surveys, title records, and county documents had shown from the very beginning. Daniel congratulated me, but immediately reminded me that ownership carried responsibility as well as rights. He advised me to avoid any action that could be interpreted as retaliation. Instead, we agreed to do something remarkably simple. We installed a new steel ranch gate exactly on the surveyed property line, where one had stood decades earlier before it had been removed during the subdivision's construction. The gate remained open while contractors carefully mounted a professionally made sign beside it that read, "Private Farm Road. Access subject to owner permission and recorded easement rights." Nothing on the sign was emotional. Nothing was threatening. Every word reflected the court's order and the county records. By the following morning, the entire neighborhood had noticed. Residents slowed their cars as they entered, reading the new sign with puzzled expressions. Delivery drivers paused to study it before continuing down the gravel road. The Homeowners Association security guards who had once stopped me now stood quietly beside their vehicle, occasionally glancing toward the gate without saying a word. They had received copies of the court order along with everyone else. Around noon, Patricia arrived in another black sport utility vehicle accompanied by the association attorney. For the first time since we met, she walked toward me without the confidence that had defined every previous conversation. Daniel stood beside me holding a copy of the certified judgment while the survey stakes remained visible along the roadside exactly where the county surveyor had placed them. Patricia looked at the gate, then at the sign, and finally at the long line of vehicles entering the subdivision one by one. School buses, landscaping trucks, utility crews, delivery vans, and families returning home all used the same narrow stretch of gravel crossing our property. It was obvious now because the legal documents had forced everyone to notice what had been overlooked for years. Patricia quietly asked whether the road would remain open. I answered honestly, "Today it is open, just as it always has been." Daniel added that any future use of the road would simply need to reflect the actual ownership confirmed by the court. There were no raised voices, no arguments, no dramatic confrontation, only the quiet weight of legal reality replacing years of incorrect assumptions. That evening, the Homeowners Association called an emergency meeting. Although I was not present, several neighbors later told me the discussion lasted for hours. Residents were less interested in assigning blame than understanding how an entire community had relied on an entrance road without ever confirming who actually owned it. Questions that had never been asked suddenly became impossible to ignore. How had this happened during development? Why had no title review revealed the problem? Why had the association claimed authority over property outside its boundaries? As the sun disappeared behind the oak trees that evening, I stood beside my father near the gate, while the familiar sound of tires rolled gently across the gravel road my grandfather had built. My father smiled quietly and repeated the same sentence I had heard throughout my life. Everything begins with the road. Only now did I finally understand exactly what he had meant. Less than a week after the court confirmed the ownership of the road, Daniel called to tell me the Homeowners Association wanted to meet. There were no more letters demanding compliance, no more security notices, and no more claims that my family had been banned from land we had owned for generations. Instead, Patricia arrived at Daniel's office with the association attorney and several board members carrying folders instead of assumptions. The atmosphere felt completely different from our first encounter at the entrance. No one spoke about authority. No one mentioned community rules. They wanted to discuss a permanent legal solution that would protect both the residents and my family's property rights. Daniel had already prepared a proposal based on the county records and the court order. The Homeowners Association would receive a permanent recorded easement allowing residents, emergency vehicles, utility companies, school buses, and service providers to continue using the entrance exactly as they always had. In return, the Carter family would remain the legal owner of the road. The Homeowners Association would acknowledge that ownership in writing, contribute to future maintenance costs through a formal agreement, and remove every policy claiming authority over property outside its legal boundaries. Patricia carefully read every page before quietly setting down her pen. She looked at me with a sincerity I had not seen before and admitted that she had accepted information passed from previous board members without ever verifying the original records. Years of repetition had turned an assumption into something everyone believed was true. I appreciated the honesty because it matched what my father had always taught me. Mistakes can be corrected when people are willing to face them. The agreement was signed that afternoon and later recorded with the county so future generations would never have to repeat the same dispute. A month later, the new entrance sign reflected the legal reality instead of confusion. The Homeowners Association replaced its old security policies with procedures that respected the recorded easement while recognizing the Carter family's ownership. The security guards who had once stopped my truck now greeted me with a friendly wave whenever I drove through. Several residents even stopped to introduce themselves after learning the actual history of the farm. Many admitted they had never known the road existed long before their neighborhood was built. On a cool autumn evening, my father and I sat on the old wooden fence overlooking the entrance as the setting sun painted the pasture in shades of gold. Cars rolled quietly across the gravel road exactly as they had every day before, but something had changed. They were no longer crossing land controlled by confusion. They were traveling across property protected by truth, respect, and a properly recorded agreement. My father reached into the old cardboard survey tube and handed me my grandfather's faded handwritten note. I carefully returned it beside the original maps before placing everything back on the shelf inside the barn where they had waited patiently for decades. As I closed the barn door, I realized the greatest victory had never been proving someone else wrong. It was preserving my family's legacy without taking away anyone else's home. My grandfather had written that the road would one day protect the family. He was right. It protected our history, our rights, and in the end, it even gave an entire community the chance to rebuild its future on the foundation of the truth.